Of all my interviews this year so far, I think I am most excited for this podcast today with Dr. Don Vu. He recently published a book about a year ago called Life, Literacy, and the Pursuit of Happiness, supporting our immigrant and refugee children through the power of reading. You had me at the title, and then you kept me at the subtitle. So, Dr. Don Vu, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
It's an honor. Could you tell us about your current work position, and so listeners have a little context of where you are?
Sure. So currently I am writing, consulting, and working with school districts and literacy organizations on just ideas for my book on literacy, working with immigrants and refugees and engaging families. So I've been in education for about 24 years as a teacher in Oakland, California, as an assistant principal and principal in San Jose. And the last 6 years, I was principal at a school in Northern California, near Sacramento, California. And all the schools I've been in have been Title I schools, large populations of students who are coming from socioeconomically disadvantaged situations, and large multilingual populations. And I think a lot of the reason why is just because it's kind of my passion in terms of working with students and families um, that have been in the margins of society and schools, and working hard to ensure that they get a fair shake in the American dream. And um, so that's it. A few months before the pandemic, I actually took a leave from my principal job a few months before, and I had no idea, just to kind of finish up writing the book and doing some more creative work. I was kind of shocked that a few months after that, after leaving, the pandemic hit, and it's been about two and a half years since that time, and since I've been out of schools. Eventually, I will go back to schools. I do miss a lot of the fun things that have happened. A lot of the families and communities. I miss that work. And I know that right now it's a very difficult time for schools, but eventually I will come back to work with kids and parents and teachers.
I think the thing that I really gravitated towards in your profile was that you were a principal, and then you're a principal of color, right?
Mm, yeah.
Serving a community of color, and I thought like, wow. In our field, we it's predominantly the representation is mostly white women, but yet in the education field, yet to see an Asian male in leadership is quite refreshing to see that because there you get to share a different perspective.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Han. I mean, you know, I it's kind of funny because in the district that I was just in, I was the only Asian American. There was one more person, but the only Asian American on the leadership team. There's like 30 people on it. Like you said, everybody else is pretty homogenous. Uh, and so it's kind of it's unfortunately rare, but I know that there are a lot of organizations right now like Apple, the California Administrators, Asian American Administrators Association in California, that are kind of focused on recruiting teachers into those leadership positions, because I think it's important not only for the kids. And we talked a little bit offline about windows and mirrors, right? With books, but it's also important for them to see, for students to see, people of different backgrounds in those positions, right? It's important for the Asian American students, but also for all the students. so that they kind of understand what the world looks like. And so that I really do think that, you know, it's improving, but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of representation in that area. Um, and you know, a lot of it's recruiting, a lot of it's, you know, just really encouraging people to to take that next step to make a difference in their schools.
So if there are uh, BIPOC teachers who are listening now, if you're considering going into leadership, we encourage you to do that. Let's dive into a story about your teaching practice that has really informed your practice today.
Hmm. So this is a story about me teaching, but it was when I was the principal a few years ago. Um, and I was working with a group of second graders, and we had this school-wide read aloud, and it was Malala's Magic Pencils, written by Malala Yousafzai, the youngest uh, Nobel Peace Prize winner. And she wrote this book about her life, about, you know, her life in Pakistan, and we had the whole school read it together. And I was reading aloud with a group of kids, second graders, and I noticed a little girl uh, listening really intently. She was just, and she had a hijab on, and she was just like stroking it. And she looked pretty happy listening to the story. And so I took that opportunity. I said, "Hey," and I said, what do you think about this book? You know, what do you, and she just, you know, she responded really quickly, and she said, you know, I'm proud of that Malala is wearing a hijab like me. And you know, it struck me because I remember a few years before that, right? A lot of our Muslim families were sending their girls to school without hijabs. You know, there was a big backlash after 9/11, and there was fear of retaliation, fear of prejudice, and discrimination, and and I just remember that it just reminded me that, you know, books and stories are powerful, right? That sharing the right books can change lives. And you know, it was just it was a good reminder for me, and it kind of just made me more passionate about the work, about literacy, and sharing those stories to reflect our kids, and to to really to really change the world. You know, I remember back in the 90s when I was teaching in Oakland. um, I remember that it was really hard to get multicultural books. All right. I mean, we'd be able to pick up the books on Martin Luther King, on Rosa Parks, but I was just ecstatic if I found a book on that featured a Vietnamese character, right, or that featured an Asian American character, or a Mexican American hero. We didn't have that, so you know, like decades later, um, it's getting better, right? It's getting better. It's still not where we need it to be, but you can find those books, and you can find those stories that reflect our kids. And so that's kind of the one of the my teaching lessons. It's that you know, these stories can make a huge difference in the lives of our kids and our families.
I think I wrote down the words you said. When we share books, they can change lives because books are representation, and when a student is represented in the culture, in the literature,
Mhm.
they feel like they are valued,
Yeah,
and they feel like they can contribute from their experience, from their cultures. And it's not just, oh, I have to.
yeah.
There's a separation between school and home, and when we share books that are more representative of our students, that divide melts away.
I completely agree. And you know, when we don't, right? When the kids don't see books about themselves or about people who look like them, then a different story, right? It gives them, well, it teaches them a lesson that, their stories are not that important, in the school or in the society. And that becomes a problem for all of us too.
It's giving a voice to the voiceless through picture
Yeah.
books, through books. Right? Every book has a seed. What was the seed for this book, and why write a book for children of refugees?
Okay. So, so the story is 2018. 2018, my school had just received the exemplary reading program award, and so I went to Austin, Texas, to the International Literacy Association conference to get the award. And I met up with an editor from a publishing company, and we talked, and we were like, okay, well, maybe I can write a book on building a culture of literacy. Um, and so that was the focus, right? Building a culture of literacy. And I spent about a year and a half writing, a draft of it, then like 6 pages, 6 chapters of this book, and we've gone back and forth uh, with this editor, and it was October 23rd, 2019. I remember that date because it was my birthday. He said, "Okay, um, we're going to take your book proposal, and we're going to take it to the editorial board and get it okayed to be published." And so I thought, cool, after a year and a half, yeah. And he called me back later that day and said, "Hey, Don, guess what? They said no. They said they're not going to go forward with publishing this book." And I was like shocked. And I was like, wait. We spent a year and a half going back and forth, working on this book, and they don't want to publish it. And I said, what happened? And he said, well, here are a few things. One, they said it sounded like a textbook. And they said that there are a lot of other books that were focused on building a culture of literacy. Stephen Lane had a book out, a few other people, and I was like devastated, right? I was like, I can't believe I just wasted a year and a half. But then part of me was kind of relieved because at that point I didn't disagree with what they said. I did feel like I didn't have a voice in it after all the editing, and I did feel like it was a textbook, and I just wasn't really passionate about what I had written. And so I asked him, I said, so what do we do next? And he said, well, good luck. And that was it. And so after like a day or two of just moping around, I just decided, okay, well, I'm gonna just kind of write, what I'm passionate about, what I really want to talk about. And so I put that focus towards, what I know, what I've worked with, and a lot of my background is in the book too. So a lot of my life. And I wrote about immigrants and refugees and how we can help immigrants and refugees through the power of reading. And I wrote like nonstop for I want to say months. It was just like I just kind of did it, and and it came out. And after a couple of months, I had a draft of a few chapters, and I shared it with a few people, and a few of my friends shared it with other friends, and somebody from Scholastic looked at it, and it was Lois Bridges, the editor who published this book. She picked it up and she just said, "Hey, I want to publish this book," and and I worked with her for about a year after that, and we went back and forth and just kind of um, and that's kind of how it happened. But yeah, it was just like a kind of an up and down journey to get this book published.
Right. I remember listening to that in another podcast, and I was like, he worked in a year and a half and it got rejected. and then
Yeah.
and then you
I didn't know
put
how it worked. I didn't know how the system worked. And so I thought, okay, well, it's probably going to be okay. And then I was kind of shocked that it just dead ended right there. But the edit, my first editor, I'm not going to say who it is, but we're still good friends, and he's a really good guy. He's helped looked at a lot of my current work, and so it's been a good experience. I mean, it's a good story, I guess.
right. Well, I'm happy that you didn't give up, right? You just said, okay, well, how can I do this in a different way? And you wrote from
Yeah.
your heart. And that's actually one of the features of your book that is just when you read the reviews and when you listen to other people's conversations about your
Mm.
podcast, when you're on a podcast, they talk about the format. And every single
Yeah.
chapter starts with a little prologue. And maybe at the end of the podcast, would you mind reading one of the prologue, one of the preludes for us? Anyone, but
Sure.
um,
Sure.
I just really it added your prologue added a level of humanity to the writing, and it became less academic. But still, there's still research in your writing, but it added a humanity, a level of humanity to your writing, which is quite unique and beautiful. It reminded me of the great Kylene Beers when
Mm.
she wrote a book when kids can't read what teachers can do. She started about a story about a student who she wasn't able to reach, and she walked us through talking about that student throughout the entire book. And that I felt like when I was reading your book, I was like, I'm following your path.
Mm. Yeah. No, that's that's the intent, right? It's because the work we do, and you know this. I mean, it's the work we do without that personal connection. It's only half of that work, right? You're only doing half of the work, and so my intent was to not only tell my story, but also to have people connect to, and to really really feel like they've gotten to know a refugee, right? And to really understand, some of the personal aspects of it, and also to maybe feel like, hey, I have this connection with Don's story, and it's going to help me maybe do work in my schools with my other immigrants and refugees. And so that was the intent. Yeah.
Well, could you tell us more about that? Then why write a book for refugees, about refugee children?
Well, because one, that's what I know. That's who I am. And that's who I've worked with for, most of my career. I mean, I see, and it's not only the children, but also the parents, right? I mean, anytime, anytime a parent who comes to me, when I was a teacher or even a principal, when, they come to me and they say, hey, can you help my kid out? In their broken English, right? But I see my parents. I see my mom coming up to the school, and I know how hard it is for immigrant parents to do that. Right? It's not only the linguistic, but the cultural stuff that But I understand how difficult it is, and so when I see that, I'll do everything I can to 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 help them, to help their children, because that's because I know that story, right? That's kind of the story of all immigrants and refugees. And so and when you have the power in schools to do that work, when you have the power to make that difference, then, I think you have to do it.
Right. I was listening to a podcast and someone said, when you write a book, you write from what you know, and from what you've grown, how you've grown, and mistakes you've made. Because
Yeah.
you're most positioned to reflect back on things you did or things that happened and how you've grown from them. And so that's your book.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about what are the what are the conditions to create a culture of literacy?
Well, it's just, I had six conditions, and it's pretty much basically organizing the ideas on how to build a culture of literacy, a culture of reading in schools for all, right? And the conditions are based on the research that you've seen, the reading research, and successful practices in schools, from others, from my experience as a teacher, as a principal, and the conditions. I have down as commitment, right? Clock, conversation, connection, collection, and celebration. And so those are six things that you kind of have to think about when building a culture of reading in schools. I focus on the needs of immigrants and refugee students. Along that, you have the students who've traditionally struggled, like the special ed students would benefit uh, from a lot of these ideas. The students who have struggled in school traditionally. So that's kind of the idea. It's like, just an organization of the ideas on building a culture of literacy. And I start with commitment, which is the idea that you have to commit to improving yourself as an educator, to opening up your your personal bubble so that you can understand and help students who are different from you.
Would you like to talk about the other five C's?
Sure. Clock is pretty much um, the idea that the more kids read, the better readers they become, and so the idea that you want to provide as many opportunities for kids to read independently as possible. And there are some considerations when working with students who are refugees and immigrants, linguistic, and also the fact that a lot of them may not have opportunities to read independently at home due to uh, the lack of books at home, or the lack of somebody who's able to read to them at home. So how do you make up for that in schools, before and after school, during lunchtime, outside of the independent reading time that you provide them in class? Conversation, I talk about, I pull the research that talks about the importance of having literate conversations, right? Um, Informal conversations, and that's easily accessible um, for kids who are just learning English, um, multi multilingual learners. So how do you have those informal conversations and promote those in schools? Connection, it's the discussion about windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors. Rudine Sims Bishop, how do you connect kids, and what do you do after you have those books? What do you do after you have a diverse library? And those are some considerations to have. Collection, it's making sure that you surround kids with lots of books, and and that has been a problem in a lot of areas, where kids don't have access to books. They don't have access to books when they go on vacation during the summer, and people talk about maybe the issues of kids falling behind. And that's a real thing, where kids don't have those opportunities to practice reading, or to enjoy reading during the summer. And so how do you make up for that in schools? And the last condition is celebration, which is just the idea that it has to be fun, right? It has to be engaging, and as a school, the adults and the kids, the families, the staff, they we need to set aside that time to celebrate stories and to celebrate one another through stories. And so, I talk about that in the sixth condition, which is, let's kind of focus on the joy of reading, right? And that's kind of how we build lifelong learners, lifelong readers, is to really make that connection.
Yeah, I when you were describing all the six C's, by the way, very clever. Of C as in culture, but also the alliteration of C's throughout. That is very cool. I could tell you were an English teacher or fond of English literature.
Yes, yes. But the funny thing is, like, everybody has like their six C's, and I've seen that. Didn't you guys you had that somewhere too? I think
Yeah,
C's,
yeah,
I or D's or T's.
yeah.
It's kind of funny, but it makes it a little bit easier to remember.
Right, right. And
Yeah,
that's when it's easy to remember, it's easier to implement. So let's talk
yeah.
about implementation. Can you take us into one of your teachers' classrooms when because I would love to see what it's like to be at a blue ribbon school where you got an award for literacy, like just a hypothetical teacher or a former colleague.
Well, one, the classroom, what it looks like is I think that has to be defined, right? You need to make sure that the classroom library is pretty well stocked. And so when you walk into the classroom, you're surrounded by books. And we did that. We actually spent a lot of money on classroom libraries. A few years ago, I just decided with my team that, if we're gonna have classroom libraries, we need to prioritize and we need to fund them. So we spent hundreds of dollars every year just having teachers buy books for their classroom libraries, which is great. One, because you get the books to the kids, and but two, you engage teachers on a certain level where they have to kind of know what's out there, right? So they have to kind of research the books that are out there, the new cool books, children's books, and also um, that they're engaged with their kids so that they kind of understand what the kids like in terms of what their interests are, because that's important too. So we would give interest surveys, like what were their hobbies, what were they interested in, do they like fiction books, do they like nonfiction books, what were the topics that they really liked. And so that based on that we'd get books. But teachers would, if you walked in, there would be a lot of read alouds, a lot of discussions on books, kids listening, asking questions, um, as they're reading aloud. That was important to have those types of conversations um, so that the comprehension was there. And the research tells you that 5 to 10 minutes a day of those conversations, of those literate conversations, um, improve reading comprehension better than any other strategy. And so, a lot of conversations, a lot of kids talking to one another about stories and books, a lot of creativity. So kids are creating their own stories, and connecting with other stories. So that's kind of like the fun part of it all. But also you do want to talk about, you do want to address some of the needs, and that's in terms of, like, the basic foundational skills of reading. So that's something that we don't want to forget about, right? It's like we do need to teach kids how to read. And so there was a lot of work on that too. So there's a balance, and you hear about that a lot nowadays, right? That the balance of teaching kids how to read and getting kids to really love to read. And so we shared our kids in terms of working with skill levels, and really having a common language, um, so that no matter who your teacher is, we knew exactly where the kids were in terms of their needs, their reading needs. And and again, a lot of fun stuff, right? Connecting the fun stuff with with reading and stories. So um, fun activities, um, like having kids do book talks with one another, recording it on video, and we did a lot of book talks and read alouds on videos where we would share it on our little YouTube channel internally with our students, and just that really kind of engaged, you know, kids and teachers and adults, and just kind of promoted that culture. It's like it's not one thing, right? Because you can't have just one or two different strategies and think that you're building a culture. It's just like it's an ongoing thing, and it's something that doesn't happen overnight. I mean, we were working for about 5 years before we were recognized for any of the work, before we got the uh, recognition from the International Literacy Association. And so it's a lot of work, but it's fun work. I mean, it's stuff that when it's done right, it becomes it becomes easier, and you know, a lot of creative things happen because of that, because of the culture, and because people are kind of on that same vision, or have that same vision, on that same path to to really engage kids. And so that's kind of what you would see.
Right. I mean, I think I have to applaud your leadership because the pressure of testing that's happening in American schools and also now in other schools around the world, they've the teachers feel so pressured to teach the test that they're not giving time anymore to reading, right? And that the
Yeah.
sad right, and the sad part is like that's actually the thing that actually helps kids the most in reading comprehension. Like I know that my students who are the best readers, the most avid readers, are the ones that are the best and proficient writers,
Yeah, the research tells you that, right?
right?
I mean, the data tells you that. And you know, we did all that fun stuff and we got the award, but we actually, I mean, it goes in hand, it goes hand in hand, right, Ton? Because that same year we got the award, and I totally acknowledge the testing because it is stressful. And you're right. I mean, it's like it's crazy anxiety ridden during that time, during this time of year right now, because this is when the state testing happens. And every year, you know, you have the report card that comes out, that tells you if you're doing well or not, and you're, you know. And that same year that we got the award, for all the fun and cool stuff that we're doing, um, in California, we have this dashboard, but every area on the dashboard, we met or exceeded um, the criteria, uh, and which is kind of rare for a lot of Title I schools. And a few months after that, we earned the California Distinguished School Award based on the data, based on the test scores, and based on, you know, the work that we were doing. So yeah, I mean, you know, you do the work, and it's not, I mean, we're an example of it, you don't you're not sacrificing, you know, the testing and all that, because eventually it will show, right? You have kids reading more, you have kids becoming better readers, and it will show on the testing. But yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of, you know, anxiety when it comes to testing, and that's, you know, that's, as a school leader, there is, I totally understand. There's this thing. Okay, well, do you like do test prep, which we did, but you know, you can't let it control everything that you're doing, and that's the dilemma. That's a really good point, Todd.
Yeah, I mean, I as a social studies teacher right now, I still make time for my kids, like 5 to 7 minutes a day. They read whenever they come in my class. That's the first thing they do, and once in a while, like every 2 weeks or every other week, I might have my kids turn and talk to the partners after this like 5 minutes of silence. They turn and talk
Hmm.
to the partners and they say, "Tell your partner, would you read this book or not?" And so they're doing little book talks together,
Yeah,
right? And that's all it is. It's like
yeah.
creating that
Those
culture.
That's important.
Speaking of culture, can we now move to a little bit from away from your school and then more of your own personal experience? What was your literacy experience like as a refugee student?
Well, I was, I was a English learner, right? So I came to school speaking only Vietnamese, obviously, just because my parents um, were speaking Vietnamese at home. And so I remember being pulled out with other kids in small groups, and a lot of them were, were Mexican American. I'm guessing a lot of them were children of migrant farm workers because I grew up in the Central Valley of California, and that's kind of, that was the population. It was, a few refugees, which was me, my my brothers, my cousin, and a few migrant children of migrant farm workers. And so, I remember working on in small groups, learning English. Um, but like a lot of kids, and there's a lot of kids. We learn English too through TV, through social interactions with other kids, and for some of us, yeah, it's not too difficult, and we pick it up. And I was lucky because I was able to pick it up pretty quickly. But I remember when I was old enough, I was I loved going to the library, the local library, um, and I would ride my bike over, and I loved just exploring the books, really seeing the world through books, because we refugees and immigrant families, most of the time they don't have the resources to travel, to have these experiences, um, like camps during the summer or whatever it is. So books really helped me explore the world, and really it helped me build background knowledge, which is something that I really stress to teachers, to educators, is that's one thing that a lot of our kids who struggle don't have. It's that background knowledge, right? It's like, when their families don't have the resources to take them to Lego camp during the summer, or to even go camping during the summer. They can't make those connections that they will eventually have to make in school. And so books kind of fill in that void sometimes. And so for me, I think that's kind of what happened. It was like, I kind of immersed myself in books and stories and literacy, and helped me fill in those voids. And so I was able to kind of understand what it was like to, I remember as a kid reading a book on Albert Einstein, right? And remember the part where he was backpacking and looking up at the stars. And not only was that inspirational, but it got me to really want to understand science a little bit more. And so I was really into astronomy for a while. And then I read books on astronomy and made those connections. But literacy was a way for me to really literacy and books and reading were windows to the world for me.
You're right. Every time I read a book, it takes me to a new place. And currently, I'm reading a book called Unwanted. It's about Syrians, the Syrian
Mm.
refugees, and even though I'm on my bed like reading, it's taking me to refugee camps. It's taking me under the bridge where the people are hiding. It's taking me right in front of that fence, that barbed wire fence. Right? And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness! It's taking me on that dinghy where people are put into crowded onto these floating boats, and then how
Mm.
waves like toss them over, and it's like taking me there, and so you can see in a different way. And I also found that my students who read the most are the most inclusive and kind students in the school or in my
Mm.
class, because they feel like, oh, I've seen this before in a different
Yeah.
way.
They know the stories, right? They know maybe they know the personal they have those personal connections through those stories, right? And that's how you, I mean, that's how you build empathy or sympathy for, those people that you don't know. It's like to know their personal stories, right? That's true.
So you talked about going to the library and that opening up your world to so many other worlds. What was your parents' involvement in literacy? I'm trying to ask this question because I want to
Yeah.
see what teachers can do to partner with their refugee and just the families on how to support students in their language development.
I don't know if it's common or uncommon. My parents were like hands off in terms of my education. I don't think my I don't think my parents ever went to any of my school events. They never showed up. One, partly because they were always working, right? And two, because I had, younger brothers and sisters, they probably couldn't just like take off and go. And honestly, there was a lot of resentment like growing up because I was like, okay, I was in the band and they never showed up for any of the concerts or any of that, right? And I'd be sitting there and all my other friends would have their parents sitting there watching. And so there was, I didn't understand it. And I didn't understand some of we talked a little bit about this, right? Some of the barriers that immigrant refugee parents face, right? When it comes to going into the school. And also I think it's cultural too. Like Vietnamese parents are always like, okay, well, I'll do the parenting at home. The school, you guys take care of, the teachers will take care of the education. And that, they were always encouraging, or at least expecting me to do well in school, right? Right. You're laughing because you're like, yeah, there's a difference between encouraging and expecting. And I think Vietnamese parents are like, okay, I expect you to do well. Um, and so that was kind of my experience. The funny thing is I talked to my wife and her mom was different. And her mom had the same English skills as my parents in terms of like, they spoke broken English, right? And they had those barriers, those language barriers. But her mom would be very involved. She would come in, didn't speak English, but would come in and go to the PTA meetings, bring her egg rolls, and and really and make her translate for her. Say, what are they saying? It's kind of like, have you seen that movie Coda, Ton?
No, I need to see it though. I heard it won an award.
Oh, it was like the best picture, best movie in the it won an Oscar, right? Best movie. But so I watched it after the Oscars, and it's like one of the best movies I've seen because it's about, well, I'll give you a short thing, right? It's about this CODA means child of deaf adults. That's the acronym. So it's about this young high schooler who grew up and her mom and dad are deaf and her brother is deaf, her older brother is deaf, and it's about her life and the fact that they rely on her. It's a close-knit family. They rely on her to translate the world to them because she can sign and she can hear. And she's like, in the doctor's office translating for her parents. And so it's pretty funny and awkward, but you know, we're watching it. My family and I were watching it, and I turned to my wife and she's crying. You know, she's crying because she connects to the story, right? And even though it's they're not deaf, her parents, but she understands that pressure that a child has translating and being the translator of the world to your family. I mean, that was like such a big connection to her that it touched her and it moved her. And that was something that again, like, stories make a difference in lives, and this is just a mirror that she was able to see. But for her parents, she had to translate, and so her mom was just like, always, okay, come to school, PTA meeting, your parent teacher conference, whatever meeting it is. um, Her mom really wanted to be involved, and it's kind of funny because she was telling me the story how she was actually being kind of bullied by my wife, as when she was in second, third grade. She was being bullied by one of the campus supervisors, the yard duties. And, this lady was pretty mean to her. And so she went home and told her mom that, this lady, is always yelling at me, and I don't do anything. I think she doesn't. And so, so her mom was like, okay, well, I want you to write this down. And she, spoke in Vietnamese, and she said, okay, this is the daughter of Maria Vu, da, 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 please, if you have a problem, let me know. If you have a problem, talk to, call me, or we'll set up a meeting. But, this lady, saying this in Vietnamese, and having her daughter translate it into English so that she can give it to this lady. And, the next day she gave that letter to the yard duty, and she was like, you wrote this. All right. And Maria was like, yeah, I did write this. My mom can't write in English, but she told me to. She wrote, I wrote exactly what she said. And, and I thought that was really touching. It's like, this refugee woman who doesn't speak English has that audacity, right? The audacity of equality, which I talk about, right, in the book, has that idea that, I and my child have equal rights to be here, to go for the American dream, to 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 live a free life. And, and I will fight for that right. So very inspirational woman.
Yes, your wife's mother is we in the Asian community we call that a tiger mother or a dragon mother, lovingly, right?
Yes,
And we
yes.
and they fight at all costs for their children, and they won't let their language stand in their way, right? And so
Yeah.
I love that. I also love that there's always food involved in parent teacher conferences. My mother was always like, when I know that I tell her that there's a conference coming up, she's like, I'm gonna go to the grocery store and get some ingredients for the egg rolls. I was like,
Yeah,
yeah,
what
yeah,
it
yeah,
is, right?
right, right.
That's the
It's
way
like
it is.
that's the way it is.
But that's something that, if people, and people think I joke about this, right? When we talk about food and the importance of food, that's important. And that's a way for families to connect, especially families who want to be involved, but they can't be because of certain things, because maybe they don't feel like their language is good enough to, like, communicate what they need to communicate. But they could cook, right? And that's what, my wife's mother, that's how she connected. She was a great cook, and she was like, I can cook, I can, like, I can contribute in this way. And then, maybe you can understand me a little bit more. Right.
Right. And you just spoke to all the multilingual teachers out there, or teachers of multilinguals, because we have something called assets-based
Yeah.
instruction, and we say, what can you contribute from your experience? Not saying, what are you lacking? It's saying, what can you contribute? Right? So
Exactly.
your wife's mother was like, I can do this. I can cook, and that's more than enough.
Oh yeah.
Right? Let's end with I have just one. Can you tell us about? Well, I listened to your other podcast conversation. You talked about parents reading to their children in their heritage language. Why should we do that?
Well, I think when parents read to their kids, right, you serve a lot of purposes, right? You build language skills, right? you make a personal connection. It's quality time, right? And 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 you associate joy with reading, right? So for me, you can do that in any language, right? And you should do that in the language that you're pretty good at, right? If you can only speak Vietnamese, then by all means, I say you do that. You have that quality time with your kid, right? You build language skills in Vietnamese, which is important, right? And then you associate joy with reading, which will translate down the road in their lives. And so I think that's definitely something you do. And so for us educators, right, Ton, it's like so what do we how do we support that, right? Well, one, we can, you know, maybe help parents understand how to do that at home, right? Where they can stop and ask questions, right? Have those conversations in their language, in their home language, where they can, go back and forth with kids instead of just reading straight through. Um, and and two, it's providing books, right? It's like I said, there are more and more books that are, you can get copies of Harry Potter in, I think, 65 different languages, worldwide. So, so there, you can find those books, right? You can find those bilingual books, multilingual books. And as educators, that's something that we're responsible for. It's like, okay, so when we build those classroom libraries, when we build those lending libraries, let's make sure that we have those books that are available so that parents who are, reading Spanish or Ukrainian, Vietnamese, Mandarin, whatever it is, that they can access that. And then, that addresses some of the need in terms of one of my conditions, right? It's clock. It's like making sure that you have independent reading time and reading time at home, because a lot of families don't have that. They don't have access to those books, or they don't have the strategies or the skills to work with their kids at home. So that's how we help them.
Yeah, I think the research on our side says that when students have literacy skills in one language, that's directly transferable to another language, and that comes from
Yeah.
Dr. Cummings. Right? My last question is traffic light teaching. What do you ask teachers to stop doing, red light, start doing, yellow light, and keep doing, green light, in
Hmm.
terms
Hmm.
of working with refugees or in literacy?
Well, that's a good question. So I'd say maybe the first thing to stop doing is to, and I think you maybe touched on it a little bit, is in terms of like looking at immigrant refugee students from a deficit lens, right? And I understand at the campus level, right, the stresses and the difficulties that people have. I know it's a tough job, especially now. And I know that, when you get a new kid in your class who comes in, has no idea what's going on, right? I can imagine the anxiety because you want to do what's best, but then you're like, how do I do it? But then you look at the assets that they bring to the classroom, right? Their experiences. So I'd say stop looking at it from a deficit lens. Um, Keep doing most. Um, I would say I would say keep trying, right? Keep working at it, even though sometimes some days it might be very difficult and it might be very discouraging. Um, because kids need you, and keep an open mind. Keep on having an open mind, and to be open to their experiences. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's a principal in my former district, and he was talking about how they just received enrolled like 5, 6 families from Afghanistan, and he said they're some of the girls are really sweet. They're just really quiet, and he was kind of keeping an eye on them because they had nothing when they came to the school. I mean, they had nothing, and so the school kind of got together and got furniture for the families, got clothes and all that stuff. But he said it was really sad because one day they had their monthly fire drills, and so it's no big deal. The alarm goes off, and then they kind of line up and go out as you know, and the little girl just sat there and started crying. And when she heard the alarm, I mean, it just like, just kind of triggered something. And so it's like, you keep an open mind and try to understand that, these kids are coming from different places, right? They may be coming from places of trauma, of distress, and, they've lost everything. And so you want to keep on doing that. And the green light,
Start doing.
start doing. I would say if you haven't done this, start thinking about the work with the immigrants and refugees, how it's not just ESL, right? It's not just, English as a second language, but it's more than that, right? It's engaging, the families and the students and building those bridges, that aren't just language based, but also cultural based and and creating a home, a new home for them in your school, in your classroom. And so, yes, they need to learn English. They need to be proficient, fluent in their target language. But, you know, they're humans, and they need to feel safe. They need to connect. And so I know a lot of people are doing that, but it's always a good reminder that, it's not just ESL. It's not just, English as a second language. So yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I think I'm going to hark back to what you said, whereas curriculum is only half the instruction. Right?
Yeah.
So let's end with a reading of one of the preludes. You can
Okay.
choose which one you like, and you can read part of it.
Let's see. So this is the first prelude. I've shared this with at a few conferences, um, just to kind of introduce myself. And so I'll just read this. This is Refugees Among Us. I have no childhood memories of being read to at home. It's not that my parents were neglectful or absent. It's not that they didn't believe in the importance of reading to children, they just couldn't read the books. In late April of 1975, my parents made a quick decision that most of us can't even fathom. We were living in South Vietnam, and it was almost certain that our country was going to fall to the communist north. Fighting had intensified in the capital city of Saigon, and my father, who worked as an electrician at the US Embassy, had heard whispers from the Americans that they were leaving within days. The writing was on the wall. The democratic South, without the military support of the United States, would crumble immediately. My father would be considered a traitor for working for the enemy, and his punishment would have been severe. And if he were lucky enough to avoid a death sentence, he would surely endure a lengthy sentence in a re-education camp. And when the US-backed president, Win Van Til, resigned on April 21st and fled the country, the decision was made. The very next evening, my parents hurriedly packed 2 bags of clothes, about $10 worth of Vietnamese currency, and a gold necklace. They knew at least the gold was worth something. They, along with my maternal and paternal grandmothers, my 6-year-old cousin, my 8-month-old brother, and me, almost 3 years old at that time, left our house for the coastal city of Vũng Tàu, several hours away. They had planned to meet with some relatives who had connections to a shipping business owner who would charter a boat to a neighboring country such as Malaysia or Indonesia and seek temporary refuge there. When we arrived on the dock in the middle of the night, my parents realized that they didn't have enough money to cover the fare for all of us. Dejected, we returned home to Saigon. The next day, my dad went to work at the embassy. One of his coworkers was shocked to see him and said, "You need to get out. It's over. We lost our country and they're flying us out." He handed my dad an official looking document written in English and told him to make a copy of it and add the names of all the family members who would be leaving. So that night, my dad, on a borrowed typewriter, made an almost identical copy of the certificate that would allow us to board the buses at the US Embassy that would eventually take us to Tân Sơn Nhất Airport. He could have waited for an official certificate, but that was a risk he was unwilling to take. In the middle of a cold morning on April 25th, 1975, we ran up a ramp into the open belly of a C-130 military plane, joined hundreds of other frightened and confused Vietnamese, and flew away from the only country we'd ever known. Saigon fell to the north a few days later on April 30th. The Americans had left, and the Vietnam War was officially or unofficially over.
Well, Dr. Vu, you know what? You can take your preludes and just take them out of your book and then republish them as a children's book.
Mm.
Your writing is a gift to our field because it lands in our hearts. And your book is also there to help us advocate for immigrant refugees. So thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful, heart opening conversation.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate it.